To our second seminar in the Econ PUBL seminar series this semester. Before I introduce our presenter for today, I just want to let you know that there are next seminars coming up on Wednesday, March 24th at 2 p.m. It's Isabella Alcaniz, and she's presenting American or Not American, the Role of Race, Immigration, and Partisanship in Shaping Attitudes About Disaster Assistance in the U.S. So pretty hot topic there. Today we have Marcus Casey from the University of Illinois in Chicago. Professor Casey is an associate professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Illinois at Chicago. He is the director of their undergraduate studies program, director of undergraduate studies, and he's a non-resident fellow in economic studies and a scholar affiliate at the Brookings Institution. And he was an inaugural David M. Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings from 2018 to 2020 and is now back at UIC. His talk today, I'll let him take it from here. Professor Casey, it's great to have you here today.
All right, thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up. I just want to say before I get started that this is definitely really ongoing research. So any comments, and concerns or thoughts on how we can, there are some things that are ongoing in terms of changing this paper. So this is an opportunity, unlike what you typically get when somebody comes in and actually has already submitted the paper or it's already close to being published. This is an opportunity to actually have some effect potentially on the paper. The name of the paper is Crime and Housing Prices, Information Content of High Frequency Data. Now, this title is, if you noticed, I'm sure Zoe sent around an abstract that I sent her. The title of the paper has actually changed multiple times over the last 9 months. So depending on, our feelings about the next set of results and things like that. So that'll give you some indication of how ongoing this research is. This wasn't the intended paper I wanted to present today, but unfortunately some things came out and I had to go to this one. This paper is also joint with Pat Bayer at Duke. Some of you might be familiar with him. And Eduardo Ardim, who's actually at Amazon, but we can't list his affiliation on our title pages for some strange reason. So, but if you're looking for Eduardo, he used to be a graduate student at Duke. And now he's an economist up at Amazon. Okay, so the paper, as I said before, is about crime and housing prices, but really that's just a setting. This is more of a methodological paper than actual, it's an actual application, but that's not the primary reason for us writing this paper. So our interest in this sort of topic, so as you might know, I'm an urban economist, Pat is an urban economist, and we're both really interested in thinking about sorting across neighborhoods and thinking about how people value, how the amenities in neighborhoods actually affect people's location choices. And so, like anything, and you're probably really familiar with this research, there's lots and lots of research on these topics, is that, how people actually value and how local amenities actually enter their location choices is a long-standing issue in economics, right? So the canonical models are the hedonic models of Rosen, and now, Rosen-Roback style models where we're looking at sorting across cities. And so amenities continue to be a really interesting topic in economics because we know they matter. Okay, so the primary ones, as you might, be familiar with, are school quality. There's lots of school quality papers, and to some degree, crime, right? There's fewer papers on crime, and I'll discuss that. There's a reason for that, right? It's just the data hasn't been as good as the data on school quality. But for any of you who've actually moved, which is probably everybody in the seminar, that's probably the primary things you looked at when you were deciding where to move. If you have children, school quality, and for everybody, crime. Okay, and so like I said before, there's a large literature that runs basically some variation on this canonical hedonic style regression, log price on some set of x's, right? Now, of course, one of the nice things is that this literature has advanced with the data. In the past, if you go back and look at the early versions of these papers, that typically were log price on a cross section of x's, and the usual problems emerge, right? It's difficult to control for everything. There's lots of simultaneity problems, right? Especially when we're trying to measure the valuation of amenities such as air quality, crime, school quality, and so on and so forth. And so with the advent of these new data that are both measured over time and at high frequency and really high granularity in terms of geography, this has allowed for, more credible causal estimation designs, right? So you see a lot of these papers over the last 15 years or so. So for example, you may remember the sex offenders paper. There's a large literature, so I'm not going to list it all. I mean, we could spend the rest of the day talking about it. The sex offenders paper of Rockoff and Linden and Pope, which was simultaneous. There's papers such as my former colleagues Ed Kung and Elliot Annenberg on foreclosures, people looking at home improvements, things like the introduction of developments funded by the low-income low-income housing tax credit. I screwed up the acronym here and so on. So the point is, in more papers come out every day, right? And so the key feature of these sorts of papers that makes them better than the old style literature is that typically they're exploiting some high frequency variation to look at, to develop some sort of credible estimate of X on housing prices. Now, the difficulty from my perspective and from our perspective, and a lot of other people who work in this field, is how do we actually interpret these estimates that come out of these hedonic style regressions? The traditional way that people interpret these things is that it's willingness to pay. But if you know anything about the actual underlying models, right, that you only get willingness to pay from these simple hedonic style regressions only under a set of really strong assumptions, right? That this is really marginal willingness to pay. We have to assume something about the heterogeneity of the people and so on and so forth. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that sort of theory. You're probably pretty familiar with it. The whole point here is that you have to impose some strong assumptions to interpret those parameters from those regressions as marginal willingness to pay. And so we're back to a story where we're interested in just interpreting those things as capitalization effects. But the actual economic parameter that we're interested in, and the one that we would use for, say, for formation of policy in an ideal world, is the marginal willingness to pay. And so the question is under what circumstances could we actually derive the structural parameter from these sorts of exercises, okay? And so, as I said at the outset, this is more of a methodological paper in the sense that we're going to propose a new method and what we feel like is a pretty simple framework relative to the really hardcore structural dynamic discrete choice models out there to decompose these estimates into two components using a latent Markov formulation. And so just to preview what I'm going to get into in more detail is that we're going to show that dynamics matter, okay? And then we're going to try to use this latent Markov formulation, which is actually pretty simple to estimate, to kind of use as an offset in a traditional hedonic style regression to account for forward-looking beliefs under some assumptions, okay? So I'm going to talk more about this. I know everybody has questions in their minds. I'm going to talk more about this in detail over the course, but I just want to set you up for where I'm going. Crime and housing prices is not the ultimate destination per se. The ultimate destination here is really trying to show you that this method actually generates something of interest. Okay, so the reason why I'm interested, and I already previewed this, is that lots of people have a lot of high frequency and detailed data to work with, right? It leads to all sorts of fancy research designs. You can't even get it past the referees these days unless you have these types of data. So, we need to think about how to work with these, right? And so as a consequence, much of the sort of methodology that people use is based on these older style sort of hedonic style regressions. And so we need to come forward. We need to move with the data in terms of the type of methodology we're going to use. And and as I said, in this specific application, we're going to illustrate the role of dynamics. But you could also use this method beyond crime. You could use this method in any sort of high frequency setting where you're worried about how people are responding to, changes in some local amenity. It could be race. As you might know, that's a big part of my research program, along with Pat's, looking at race, or you might be interested in air quality and things like that. What we believe is that this method could actually be helpful in those contexts as well. Okay. Yes? Does somebody have a question? Oh, okay.
No.
Somebody has a child. Okay.
I think the cupcake's are ready now.
So there's two broad areas, that we're gonna contribute to in this paper, hopefully, when it's all finished, right? Is one, we're gonna develop this simple model-based framework. So it's a structural model, okay, that can potentially be used to separate the dynamic effects captured using this high frequency variation, okay? And specifically, we're gonna focus on how the realization of a change in an amenity affects expectations and beliefs. So what we're interested in is how much are people using new information relative to older information in terms of making their decisions, in this case, on what to bid for prices. And then, and hopefully, we're going to show using a research design here that we can do this in a causal framework, like many of the more reduced form models that you see in the literature. Okay, so I'm going to, just as a quick roadmap, I'm going to talk a little bit about the data sets here that we're going to use. Then I'm going to present some more reduced form capitalization effects of the monthly effect of crimes on housing prices. And then I'm going to present our model. I'm not going to go through all the details given our time constraints here. I know that you guys go for an hour and 15 minutes, and I didn't want to overload you with notation. I'm just going to give you a flavor of what the structural model looks like, and then how it performs in relative to the reduced form capitalization effects model. And then I'm going to conclude and talk about where we're currently going, and where we plan to go forward. So like I said, any suggestions or comments on any of this will be greatly welcomed. Okay, so the data we use, we're going to have data basically on the universal housing transactions in Chicago. We got these originally from DataQuick, which is now a part of CoreLogic. I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of papers using these CoreLogic data. The nice things about these data is that they give you the actual sales price as opposed to the census, and even, for example, Zillow, but Zillow is pretty good, and the actual data closing. We also have a set of housing characteristics. We have house type, so we're going to be able to distinguish between single family homes, condos, townhouses, and so on and so forth. We know their square footage, number of rooms, number of bathrooms, and so on and so forth. We also receive a flag for any improvements. So if we see substantial changes between the times in which these houses are sold, we're going to be able to deal with that to some degree. It's not perfect though. We also have the transaction type. So whether it's an arm's length transaction, we're basically going to focus on arm's length transactions, so we can select out and get rid of sort of estate sales, you know, situations where parents are selling to their kids and so on and so forth, so we can get an accurate sense of the market sales price. We also have detailed location information from these data. So we get census tract and block group, an actual block, to be honest, in these data, though I'm not going to exploit that level of granularity. And we also receive the latitude and longitude, which we're going to use to actually map out our buffers. Okay, and we're going to match these data. Crime data from Chicago. It's a publicly available crime database. If you're not familiar with it, you can go on the City of Chicago website and download it and use these data. You'll see a lot of papers over the next few years, I suspect, using these data. It stretches from 2001 to the present, so you can go download them now. And the nice thing about these data are that they're pretty well detailed, right? They're disaggregated by crime type, the timing of the crime, the geography down to the 100 block, and so on and so forth. So they're really the type of data that we want to use in this setup to get a better sense of how people are responding to local crime events at houses that they're bidding on. Okay, and so there are some trade-offs here that we need to think about, right? Because most people extol the value of these high frequency data that's so granular, mainly because, you know, we can match up timing and type of crime to transactions, right? And so we avoid some of the earlier work on the problems of some of the earlier work that tended to aggregate and estimate yearly crimes on housing prices, right? But we don't know in a lot of those applications when those crimes actually occurred. If crimes occurred after the sale of the house, then it's not necessarily clear that people have used those crimes in making their decisions, right? Unless they had perfect foresight or something like that. And we're gonna argue that, but we're gonna argue it in a slightly different way later. Not that people have perfect foresight, but that they can form probability expectations over past crimes to forecast future crimes of that house, right? Okay, they might also be estimating different things, right? So we're interested in how crimes actually enter in your location choice. These places might be looking for a latent value that we call safety, but you know, you can probably argue that on the margin that might not be what's being priced, in the sense that most people play kind of a directed search game when they go out and look for houses. They don't just, even though the typical way that we model this in urban economics is that, oh yeah, this is a faceless plain, but in reality, most people kind of know which neighborhoods they want to search in, right? And they've kind of specify what sort of, you know, some general, they have some priors over crime rates. Like, for example, most people in this room wouldn't probably go looking around in West Baltimore for housing unless they knew that this particular block was safe or whatever. I was watching The Wire recently, so that popped into my head. You know, so, but the drawbacks here, of course, is that disaggregation at this detailed time and geography almost surely leads to noisier estimates than you would get otherwise, right? You need to have a number of crime events to happen. And this is one of the key limitations of the paper, because, you know, I'm estimating this in Chicago, and if you know anything about Chicago, you probably do something similar in Baltimore, that these are relatively high crime places. In some places, it might not work as well, these types of applications, in large part because there's so few crimes that you might get really noisy estimates. Okay, so I've already sort of said something about the cuts in the data. So like I said, we focus on single family homes sold via arm's length transactions. We basically use the buyer names to remove homes purchased by trusts, banks, and other sorts of corporations that are out there. That's about 90% of the data. So we drop all homes with missing house characteristics. So that's about 30% of the data, but a lot of that percent is associated with these single family homes So that's not quite 30% of the data. That's about, 22% of the data. But that leads to 30% of our original data set going away. And we're going to restrict our attention to aggravated assault, robbery, sexual crime, motor vehicle theft, burglary, and larceny theft. Now, we could actually deal with the dropped all homes with missing house characteristics by estimating a repeat sales model. And so we've done that. And our results are mostly robust to using only a repeated sales model. And this is a question that often comes up in these frameworks, right? Which is the right, more representative data set? We figured for this situation, this type of application, we thought that it's better to use as many houses as possible, including those that don't sell that many times in our observation period, because we're interested in how crimes are entering location decisions. But that's just a choice. We could have easily estimated the repeat sales model, but that would have been a much smaller sample. And thus, given the research design, it would have led to much noisier estimates as well. And so, as you're going to see when I start showing you the estimates are already noisy. So we're effectively playing with fire by going down the repeat sales. So that's just a trade-off here. It's inherent in all these sorts of applications. And that's something that you can ding me on if you want, but you can't really do much better than that, to be honest, unless you had complete data. Or the alternative would be is not worry about so many X's. And, we could keep more data in there, but then you might not be making the right sorts of comparisons. So again, this is just the standard sort of choices that you have to make as an empirical researcher. I'm just being upfront about that's the trade-off that we decided to make. Okay, and so we, like I said before, we restricted our attention to aggravated assault, robbery, sexual crime, motor vehicle theft, burglary, and larceny and theft. So we excluded domestic violence crimes. They may be of interest in another circumstance, but I'm not sure how that enters somebody's location choice. But you may disagree, especially if it's a particularly heinous crime, like something that shows up on SVU. But we didn't see a whole lot of those in these data. And so we also excluded things like I think we excluded like small things like car accidents leaving the scene of a crime or something like that. Those things. It's not clear that those sorts of things actually enter people's location choices either. Okay, and so we use data over the period between 2003 and 2012. So like I said, this has been an ongoing project for a while. And so, these data probably could be refreshed, but we just haven't got around to them. We could go farther back in time, but the reason why we don't go farther back in time is because of the little thing called the housing crisis that occurred between 2007 and 2009. We got a little worried about how to deal with that, and so basically we kept things as they are, but we account for that in our estimation for that time period because we have pretty specified time data. And we're also worried a lot about the run-up in prices between 1997 and 2003 and how that would bias. So we could have gone back to 1997, but if you know something about the prices between 2000 say 2000 and 2003, you saw a huge run-up in prices. And so again, we can stretch this out, but we thought this was a good sample for the types of stuff, for everything that we needed in the data. Okay, we count the number of crimes of each type that fall within a predetermined distance. So we did this at a lot of different distances. So from 0.4 all the way out to a mile. We thought that in down to 0.2 miles of a house, we thought that 0.4 sort of split the difference pretty well. Point two, we get really, really noisy estimates, and we don't get, because just so few crimes happen. Point four, 0.2 miles close to a house. Point four keeps you really localized, whereas if you get farther out, it's no longer clear that we're in a local space or a local radius of a particular house. If you don't know Chicago very well, 0.4 miles is effectively somewhere around 3 blocks around the house, 2 to 3 blocks. Whereas if you get out to 0.6, 0.7 miles, you're talking about stretching into other neighborhoods for a lot of places, right? Because that's close to a mile. That's like 6, 8 blocks in some circumstances. So we thought that 0.4 was a good cutoff, but of course, you know, that was a researcher choice. That's not dictated by any sort of data issue or modeling issue. Okay, and so what we do here is that we count crimes for each house, that radius, that 0.4 miles for each house, up to 749 days before the sale and up to 100 days after the sale. Okay, so when I say month, what I'm really talking about here is the 30 days around the actual closing date of the house, not actual calendar dates. Okay, and so, and the reason why we do this is that we're going to aggregate up these crime incidents by month, right? We don't want to do daily crimes because it's just in weekly crimes, it's not clear that those things, those levels of aggregation were actually right. We thought a monthly crime would be granular enough over time so that people could be using this, but also it allowed us enough crime such that we can actually get something besides nonsense. So of course that's something that we could play around with as well, but we thought a month would be good. And what we do here is that we aggregate and index time in these 30-day increments relative to the date of the sale, right? So when I show you some pictures, if you see -2, right? -2 is effectively 60 days prior to the closing date of that sale, okay? Whereas T=1 is 1 month, 30 days after the sale. So within that 30 days after the sale, we're gonna aggregate up at those points. Like I said, these are just modeling choices. Then there's nothing pre-specified about them. And so again, they're open to criticism. And so our reduced form empirical strategy here is to estimate a model for log price of house I and neighborhood N at year quarter T, basically comparing, you know, the effect of a monthly crimes within 0.4 miles relative to other crimes that occurred outside of that 0.4 mile distance, but still happen within the same block group. So our neighborhood here is going to be block group, and each observation is going to consist of a house within a block group, right? And we're going to compare housing prices, the effect on housing prices for crimes that occurred within that 0.4 radius relative to crimes on houses that occurred within the same block group time period, but outside of that 0.4. Okay?
Marcus, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
For the crime data, how good is that kind of geographic location?
Oh, it's pretty good. It's fantastic. We've plotted it all over. This is what the city uses for its CompuStat, right? To track crimes. This is
like
what they're using.
GPS coordinates?
Yeah, so we have everything down to latitude and longitude. It gives us all the way down to 100 level block. But it doesn't give us actual houses. So that's because for privacy concerns, but we get it down to the block level. So we're pretty good here. And so we estimate this equation here for crime type. So our baseline is going to distinguish between property crimes and violent crimes. And just to go back, I don't know if I mentioned this. So motor vehicle theft, burglary, and larceny are going to be considered as property crimes in our data, and all the rest of these crimes. So murder, I left off homicide. Sorry, that's the big one. I don't know how I left off homicide. Murder or homicide, aggravated assault, robbery, and sexual crimes are going to be considered violent crimes. Okay, so, and that's the way we're going to group the data. We're going to estimate this equation jointly for all crime types. We're going to cluster our standard errors at the census block group level. We're going to include, in addition to the X's of the houses and these neighborhood by time fixed effects, we're going to include controls for seasonality. Now, I must say, you know, as I said before, the drawback in estimating this, right, is that it restricts the variation that we're using, right? This is within census block group time variation, so the estimates are going to be noisy as a consequence, but we figured we err on noisiness, right? And not let, if we're going to estimate a causal model of crime, we would prefer to be a little bit more noisy and have a little bit tighter variation than using a broader set of a broader geographic area, which may, you know, may confound things a little bit because things can change quite a bit across census block groups in Chicago. Okay, now our main identification assumption here is that any omitted factors correlated with crime have to have constant intensity within the census block group. And so, so basically, you know, we can't have something crazy going on in some parts of the census block group that are affecting different parts of the census block group differentially. That's basically what that means. Okay. And so again, it's just sticking closely to the neighborhood context. I'll give you a funny story. When I presented this paper the first time, I presented this at the Chicago Fed, and Chris Tabor gave me a lot of guff because he said, "What if somebody opened up a Starbucks, and lots of people went to the Starbucks?" You know, that would generate potentially differential intensity within the census block group if people were targeting people near that Starbucks. But so, I mean, you know, if you think that's possible and you think that matters, then that would be a potential confound in this context. But I'm going to maintain this assumption here, and I'll let you argue with me about it ex post. Okay, so the way we're going to interpret these alphas, these coefficients from this regression, are not as marginal willingness to pay. They're not. Okay, we're going to interpret this as the capitalization of an additional crime, monthly crime, into housing prices, tau months or tau days from the sale of a home. But we are using dynamic variation, so that's really the interesting thing here. And we're going to interpret this as this is the capitalization effect. When people are sorting across neighborhoods and trying to learn more about neighborhood crime, they're going to use this past information that they have available and use that in their decision on how to bid and sort. Okay. And so what we're interested in looking at here is how important is that past information relative to more recent information. Okay. And whether it looks like any of that information that comes from crimes that occurred after the actual closing date of the house, whether any of that actually enters in their decisions, right? And the reason why that afterward is very important is because what we're positing is a sorting model that people are using past crimes. They may be using that to forecast future crimes, but the actual crimes themselves do not enter directly in their choices, right? And so they should have no effect in this type of estimation. They should only come through the action of beliefs, and that's where the structural model is going to come in. Okay, and so just to give you a little bit of data here, I'm going to speed things up. I know I'm running behind out of time. So here, this is just the incidence of crime in a 0.4 mile buffer around every house. So the average house has about 1.12 assaults that occurs. about 0.33 homicides. Chicago is a pretty high homicide city. Motor vehicle theft, about 4.8, 6.2. So, but as you can see here, there's a lot of variation across houses, right? So in most houses, thankfully, don't actually have a homicide occur near there within 0.4 miles, but some houses have quite a bit, right? Most houses, the typical house doesn't have a sexual assault occur within a 0.4 mile, but some have quite a few, 6, right? And the same thing with violent robberies and other types of violent crimes. If you look here, and as you might expect, most houses, regardless of where they're at, have property crimes that occur near them. And that's going to be important because this is something we're going to look for in our estimates, right? We should, if most houses have quite a few property crimes, we're going to posit ex ante that we shouldn't expect people to sort strongly on property crime, but they might sort pretty strongly on violent crime. Okay, so let me just show you some estimates here, right? So overall, as I said before, they're pretty noisy, but a clear pattern emerges, right? And we see this in all sorts of circumstances. So crimes that occur pretty far back in time. So remember, each of these -5, -6, -7 represents a month, okay? So 30 days. So crimes that occurred 7 months ago here at point -7, there are really 210 days before the actual closing date of the house, right? And as you can see here, that back here, there isn't really much effect here, though we get a positive estimate, negative estimate here at 9 months. But generally we get zeros. Where most of the action is going on is within 1 to 3 months before the actual sale of the house. And why does this make sense? Well, it's because that's when most people are making their decisions on which houses to buy. Okay, so remember, the closing date is not when you actually put a bid in. You typically put in a bid in based on your information about a month and a half before you actually try to buy the house. So if you think about which crimes are actually entering the decision process, okay, you should expect those that if people are using very local in terms of time information to decide how much to bid on a house or not, then we would expect most of the effect to show up within 1 to 3 months around the actual closing date beforehand. Whereas after the house, as you can see, we get basically zeros, which is consistent with what we argued, that if people are using this information, crimes that occurred within 1 to 3 months before they actually sold, then you wouldn't expect any of these estimates to show up in the actual sales price, right? These might be forecasted through beliefs, but that's going to show up in a present discounted value in their bids. And so we shouldn't expect these things to actually affect the actual sales price of a house. And I'm going to show you this. So in robbery, we see the same effect. So there's a lot more robbery, so the estimates are much smoother. And as you can see here, we see the same sort of pattern, right? And I'm going to show you sexual assault. We see the same sort of pattern. The sexual assaults get publicized pretty well, and so they actually come in pretty strong. Assault, right? We see the same sort of pattern, okay? But really, the most salient crime here is homicide, okay? You see the same sort of pattern. And homicides, if you look at this, one additional homicide lowers one additional homicide in the month before, a month or 2 months before the actual sale of the close of the sale has a 1% effect on housing prices. And so this is consistent with our priors, right? Homicides are very salient. They're very well reported, and people actually respond to them very strongly. And so that's where the biggest coefficients are. But we also see that people responded to other types of crimes as well. And given that homicides tend to be correlated with other violent crimes, that could be part of what's being picked up over across all of this, is that people are using information in those observed crimes leading up to when they're bidding on houses to decide how much on the margin they'd be willing to bid to live in that particular house. And again, after the actual sales, the close of the sale, we don't find any real effect on housing prices. By contrast, if we look at property crime, it's all over the place. Okay. And, you know, if anything, we find all sorts of things happening here. And one reason why is that property crimes occur everywhere. And they're actually, you know, I didn't have time to show you all the data, but basically property crimes are actually positively correlated with housing prices, right? Places that are richer and have more expensive houses tend to have more property crime or more reported crime. Nobody stopped me there on that. Okay, remember all these are reported crimes, so that's one caveat here that I forgot to mention. But property crimes tend to be very reported in wealthier areas, and as a consequence, they tend to be positively correlated with housing prices, not. So motor vehicle theft, as you can see, nothing really shows up. And so what we take away from this is that relatively recent crime seems to be more heavily capitalized into prices. And so one thing that it suggests is that past crimes, old crimes, the information from those tend to depreciate pretty quickly, okay? And the reason for that is, and I won't be able to go into this because of the time constraints, but the reason why this is that even at the track level, that tracks change a lot over years, from year to year, in the terms of their level of crimes, right? Some of that could be driven by police behavior. And that's something that we plan to try to include in the future, is to actually put in some information, collect some information on police behavior or major police responses to put in here. But so that's one possible reason why you see such changes from year to year in terms of levels of crime at the track level. But the other thing that we see here, and again, consistent with my beliefs, is that violent crime, especially homicide, really seems to matter, right? You hear about a homicide on a block, people are responding negatively to that, right? Property crime is capitalized minimally. And then we also find really no strong evidence that crimes occurring after the sale are being capitalized into the current sales price, which is consistent with the idea that people are using this information about observed crimes into their current bidding and sorting behavior. Okay, Yusuke, you asked a question. Can you say it, Yusuke?
Sure. Yeah, I thought I'd tap in the chat since you're going through some important results here. So yeah, do you have a sense of what the typical turnover rate for home ownership is in your data? So, you know, and I guess what I'm getting at is, you know, the relevant time duration between crimes and, you know, the capitalization might depend on the typical homeowner's time horizon for how long they expect to live there, perhaps, right? So if they are if most homeowners buy a place and plan to stay there for 10 years, then how they form their expectations about the crime they are exposed to during that period would be different from somebody who's planning to live there for 2 years. And then perhaps these, you know, more recent crimes are more salient. So, yeah, I was just wondering whether that would be something that would, you got out of your data, perhaps from your repeat sales data.
Yeah, so actually, it was something somewhere in the neighborhood on average. It varied across neighborhood, but on average, of course, because some neighborhoods have condos and a lot of neighborhoods have detached single-family homes. But it was somewhere around 6.8 years, right, okay, on average. But there was a lot of variance. So, you know, some of that might play a role, and that might play a role in sort of how the variance in the beliefs is going to shake out. That's something interesting that would be nice to kind of investigate more, though, is how that variance might actually play a role in how that variance might play a role in terms of our estimates about beliefs later. So yeah, that's a good idea. Somebody else asked a question. Could you say it?
I don't know. David Mitch asked, related to turnover issues, how do you allow for gentrification trends?
Well, everything, remember, this is all at the block group time level, right? So if you thought that gentrification is occurring, within a block group, right, we're going to capture that, okay, in the block group by time. And this, like I said, this is where the granularity, right? Gentrification occurs often in very, very localized settings, right?
So how are you capturing that?
It's going to be captured as long as it's affecting block groups equally, and that's an assumption I'm going to make here. It's going to be sucked up in the block group by time fixed effect. So remember, we're going to be estimating crime effects.
You're controlling for it. I'm just wondering about that actually affecting, the pricing dynamics and also sort of crime responses.
Yeah. So again, right, that should be captured if and this is, like I said, our maintained identification assumption is that anything else is going on that's unobservable is going on at the constant intensity at the census block group level. So if gentrification is ongoing, I mean, our maintained assumption is that at the census block group level, it affects that census block group equally. And so it'll be captured in the block group by time fixed effect. Does that satisfy you?
Well, I guess I'm a little bit unclear. I don't want to hold you up too much, but what is the variation within the block group regarding crime?
So the variation is across distance to the house. So remember, our research design compares within the same census block group time period, right? So month, right? We're comparing within the census block group month whether crimes occurred 0.4 miles within a house versus elsewhere outside of that range within the same block census block group. So the variation is within a census block group time period across this 0.4 mile radius within a house.
But I guess what's been bothering me throughout is you really haven't said what determines crime rates. And I would have thought that, where are these criminals coming from?
I mean, actually, it's not important. All I need is that conditional on my census block group fixed effects. And I just need that the crime that is occurring as good as random between 0.4 miles and outside that 0.4 mile radius within that census block group. That's what I need for identification. Now, if I wanted to explain how, something about crime here, right? But I'm not trying to explain anything about crime per se. I'm saying conditional on this stuff, where that crime occurs is as good as random in my data. That's my identification strategy. That's a different, that's an interesting paper indeed. I mean,
I guess what I'm bothered about is sort of temporary versus permanent effects.
Yeah. So I have to assume that if this is happening as good as random, right, that, you're thinking about permanent differences across places. But again, that's why I'm using the census block group versus time fixed effect, right? That's going to deal with, permanent effects, permanent time effects, and permanent differences across neighborhoods is measured by a census block group. I can't do much better than that. I mean, I guess, did you have something in mind here?
Well, I guess I'm still unclear why, if I'm a rational homeowner and I see these variations, to what extent is this you say it's random, or is this something I can expect, if I'm going to be there 10 years, it's going to be an ongoing basis over 10 years. And it's not clear to me. I would think it's more of an issue maybe for the violent crime than I'm also concerned about the endogeneity issue, which is probably more of an issue with the property crime, but I'm just not that convinced if these are sort of random events, why the crime.
I'm saying they're conditionally random, but I'm not going to argue that I'm not arguing that the homeowner is seeing them as random. I'm saying from the econometrician's perspective that I'm treating these as good as random. What I'm going to show you later, and I need to move along here, but what I'm going to show you later is that I think that homeowners are using their information about these crimes to form future beliefs. And I'm going to show you that dynamics accounting for these beliefs under some assumptions are actually going to matter a lot in terms of estimating these effects. So Can you give me a few more minutes and I can move forward? Okay, so let me just give you a quick overview of what the model is. And that was that exchange was actually very good for thinking about how we're gonna actually try to model this, right? So that's what I had showed you before is what's typical in the literature. And what we're gonna try to do is kind of step forward and try to put some more structure on that problem. So maybe this will help a little bit, David. Okay, so our goal here is to build a tractable framework that'll help us recover marginal willingness to pay. We're going to make two key assumptions here. We're going to assume that agents are forward-looking and use data on past crimes to form expectations, right? And we're going to form expectations about the probability distribution of crime around a house today and going forward, right? So they're going to use past crimes, observable past crimes, to form expectations about the future. And then, so we're going to allow this distribution of crime to vary over time, right? And it actually does. Like I said, I don't have time to show you the data, but when, I get the newest draft of the paper, you can ask me for it. I'll show you that actually there's a lot of time variation over at the tract level and census block level of the level of crimes, right? And what we're going to do here is try to decompose this effectively into two pieces, right? How much is information that we're going to use to make our current, bids, and how much of this is preferences about the future, right? So beliefs about the future. Okay. And so our two stages here are going to be, we're going to estimate a statistical model of crime using latent Markov methods, right? And this is kind of a standard approach now, especially in machine learning applications and so on and so forth to learn about behavior. We're going to specify the statistical model of crime and use that to construct agent beliefs, basically imposing a Bayesian updating assumption, right? And this estimation, the key thing is this can be done in any sort of software outside of the decision problem, right? Doesn't refer anything to the decision problem, right? We're going to estimate these beliefs, and then we're going to estimate people's decision problems conditional on these beliefs, right? Then we're going to be very simple here. We're going to specify a very stylized model of location choice. We're going to make some strong assumptions here, but this is what we're working on to kind of build in some more heterogeneity. For what I'm presenting here, we're going to assume homogeneous preferences over crime. We're going to assume that once a house is purchased, individuals keep it indefinitely. This is why I thought that your question was very important, Yusuke, because we're going to assume it's an absorbent state. In this context, in reality, is typically not an absorbent state, and that may vary. So that might be another source of heterogeneity that we're smoothing over that might actually matter. Okay, but the reason why we make these strong assumptions, as I'm going to show you, is that it's going to deliver us a linear pricing function of house characteristics in the present discounted value of crimes, right? That looks kind of like these hedonic style estimators that are used in the literature. So the regression that I'm going to bring out of that's theoretically consistent is actually going to look a lot like what we already showed you. Okay, and that's why we think this is really interesting, because this is all stuff that's can be done sort of off the shelf without having to do the heavy duty discrete choice modeling that a lot of the hardcore structural papers do, right? And this can be easily extended to allow everything to depend on other observables. So again, these are all sources of heterogeneity. Like I said, this is a methodology paper, but this is all sources of heterogeneity that people who want to use this for applications can build into the model, right? And so here's the assumptions. I'm going to go through these real quick because I know we're running short on time. We're going to assume each house is in one of k possible states here. It's going to be 4, right? Defined by some probability distribution function of total monthly crimes. We're going to assume that the sequence of states is unobservable to the home buyer and the econometrician, but we observe realizations of that process. So the latent Markov model, or the hidden Markov model is going to help us sort of recover that process, okay? Right? So we're going to make 3 assumptions here that are pretty standard in these sorts of settings, right? We're going to assume independence, right? And this is a standard Markovian assumption. We're going to assume that conditional on a house's current state, right? The distribution of crime does not depend on the past history, future realizations, or on the history of other houses, right? The history of the other houses is very, very important, right? Because that's what gives us, maintains our independence. Okay, and then we're going to also assume that the parameters of the linear latent Markov model are homogeneous across houses and time. Very, very, very strong assumption, right? But it allows us to work with it, right? And so these assumptions allow us to kind of summarize our model of crime with these objects, right? We got a k/1 vector of the probability distribution of crimes in each state. We got a k/k transition matrix of states and a k/1 vector of initial probability. So basically the initial ranking of neighborhoods, right, in these states. And that's basically, that's where we're going to use as our prior in our decision model, right? We could just assume a uniform prior as well, but that's probably too strong, right? There's clearly a difference between Lincoln Park and Inglewood and Chicago. Okay, and so we're going to assume buyers know the LMM model. So they don't know the true probability distribution, but they know the model. Okay, they observe the monthly realization of crimes. They use Bayes' rule to update what the future is going to look like, right? So as you can see here, we start with a prior. We observe what happened today. We update our beliefs, states transition, and then we form beliefs about the next period. Okay, and the Bayesian updating rule takes into account new information on crimes at each time, right? Like I said before, we're going to use the initial rankings, right, as our priors, but we can calculate easily our state transitions for any periods out to the future, based on the posterior from this beliefs setting, right? And so what this allows us to do is just gives us a one-step updating rule each period, okay? And given the Markov structure, it's easy to sort of simulate out what people expect is going to go out, how many periods out in the future as we want. So that we're going to use that in our structural model to approximate beliefs, okay? And so the setup here again is that buyers have homogeneous preferences over crime. Buying is an absorbing state. House prices are an equilibrium outcome, right? Conditional on state S, the value of a house is the present discounted flow of expected utilities, okay? And so basically let new S here be our conditional value function, i.e. the value you get from buying that particular house, and state S. And then the recursive value function can be easily calculated. This is all standard sort of dynamic discrete choice framework. So where we have vectors here, right? We expected utility given a given state, right? And so the value of a house at the beginning of a period before crime is observed. So this is before the shock happens effectively. If you remember your dynamic discrete choice models, right? Is this, right? And then so therefore we can solve assuming linearity of log prices and imposing our standard spatial equilibrium assumption, right, a non-arbitrage equilibrium condition, we can actually solve for a pricing function. This is log prices here, even though I put it as PIT, but this is actually log prices. We can solve for a linear pricing equation that looks something like this, right? Okay, and so then we can basically approximate C. C is just, you know, observable stuff. And then this is the present discounted value of crime. So here prices are adjusting to accommodate the current danger and expectations about the future crime, right? And so the way we actually do this, and I know I'm running behind here, is that for a given crime type, area, and number of states, we estimate the latent Markov model. Remember, this is separate from the decision problem. This is completely outside the model, right? We're going to make some assumptions, but we could have done this non-parametrically, but we're going to make a Poisson assumption that each type of crime is distributed Poisson with rate lambda j, and it makes the model parsimonious, okay? And like the reduced form model, we estimate that whole process for 25 months out to 4 months after for each individual house, right? And basically we solve this using a repeated iteration, the EM algorithm, if you remember that from your from your first year econometrics. Okay, so we use a sequence of monthly crimes and LM estimates to estimate prior beliefs using that Bayesian updating formula. So we estimate the process, then we go back for each house and actually estimate, use that sequence of monthly crimes and LMS estimates to estimate buyer beliefs for each transaction in the data, okay? And then after constructing these beliefs, we put together the pricing equation. And so like I said, it's linear, right? So this is our present discounted value of crimes, right? This is our X's. Notice here, I made a hidden assumption that I didn't tell you, that I assumed that in the utility function that all this stuff was additively separable. So that's another assumption that's floating around here that gives us this nice linear form, okay? And so basically what we can do is estimate this present discounted value of crimes, right? We put in our other X's, we put in our fixed effects, like we did in the other model, right? The census block group by year fixed effects, by quarter fixed effects here. And then we also need to make an assumption on the intertemporal discount rate. We assume that beta is 0.995, which is roughly 5% per year. That might be a little big in certain circumstances. And in this case, because it's all coherently estimated, the alphas here are actually interpreted as marginal willingness to pay to avoid one crime today. Somebody had a question? Justin? Oh, okay. So let's look at the LMM results. So whole lots of results. This is just an example. So this is an example of the transition matrix for violent crime, okay? And so the way you can read this is the probability of going from state one to staying in state one is 0.993. And as you can see here, off diagonals are pretty small, right? So in terms of violent crime, that once a neighborhood is in a particular state, it has a high probability of staying in that particular state, right? These are initial probabilities. Actually, you can see here, state one is the high violent crime rate state, right? And so in places that are relatively violent, they tend to have a high probability of staying violent in the next place. Whereas places that have low violent crime have a high probability of staying in that particular state, right? And here are the relevant lambdas for each state, okay? Same thing for property crime. You know, there's a lot of stickiness, but there is some variation. So in both cases, the point that I want to make here is that, you know, people are using information. This information is relevant, but in places are relatively sticky, but not completely sticky, right? And so if you're worried about crime and you can only afford places, this is why I talked about the directed search problem. If you only can sort to places that may have moderate to high levels of crime, then you might be forming expectations at that house on whether that place is either going to transition from the highest crime state to the less high crime state. And if you're sorting to places that have relatively low crime, what you're worried about is whether it's going to move primarily in those directions. Very few, almost none, are going to move from the lowest crime state to the highest crime state, which is very, very important because that rarely happens. Probably almost never happens. Okay, this is a performance of the structural model. Now, for some reason, we have some sort of level shift down, but the key thing that I want to make the point is that this is all simulated from our structural model. So we're able to match the variation in the data, not quite perfectly in terms of levels. And so we might be missing a shock somewhere, but we're able to match the time decay of the time decay pattern in the data. And this is all simulated, right? So this tells us our model is doing pretty good. It's not perfect, but it's doing pretty good, right? And so now what we do is we actually take our estimates, right? So the way to read these tables is, so the estimates are quite small because we're looking at one additional crime in the previous, in month of 30 days or 60 days or 90 days, right? So the estimates are small individually, but if you can think about it, in some places, you know, you have a lot of crime, you have little crime, and so put it up over time. And as you can see here, right, the marginal willingness to pay to avoid a crime, one additional crime, is, minus 0.0005 for violent crime is statistically significant, whereas for property crime, it's not statistically significant and really small, right? And once we allow for more states, so much finer distinctions, right? We see that this violent crime estimate goes down, but it remains statistically significant, and property crime doesn't have much of an effect. And to see the impact of using dynamics relative to imposing a static assumption, as we would in our normal capitalization equation, right? So remember, these regressions look kind of alike, right? So if we assume that people weren't forward-looking, right, then basically, as you can see here, we would get much smaller static estimates than we would in the dynamic case, right? So this again goes to
jump in because we're running out of time. I want to make sure we have some time for questions.
Okay, I only have 2 more slides.
Okay, great.
Okay, so let me run through the slides and then I'll let everybody ask questions. Okay, I just want to show you for 30 days. So this is allowing for 30 days to enter the decision problem. These are 60 days. You see the same sort of pattern, right? That the coefficients are bigger in the dynamic case relative to the static case. Violent crime matters a lot more than property crime. Okay, 90 days, same thing. You get virtually the same. So it's in that 30 to 60 day range, right? That really matters in the decision, and it matters in terms of the dynamics. The dynamics matter. People are forming beliefs about about the future, and that those beliefs are actually playing a role in where they're sorting. Okay, and so just to finish the interpretation, then I'll let you guys ask me some questions. Basically, we find strong marginal willingness to pay to avoid violent crime. That's somewhat larger than the reduced form, suggests that information content in the arrival of violent crime might be useful to people in their location choices. Property crime is noisy and low marginal willingness to pay, right? And people, because it happens everywhere, people can't really form dynamic beliefs over it, okay? But again, there's more work needed. And like I said, this is ongoing work. Okay.
Great. Happy to take questions. Graduate students, I encourage you to ask questions, and you're also welcome to send me a private chat with your question, and I can relay it to Professor Casey.
I can ask a question while others find their questions. Just a kind of a background type of question. So in Chicago, how do people learn about crime at the sort of hyper-local level, the way you've been looking at? So, the way I remember doing it, for DC is Washington Post has, they take in the public database and they have some mapping tools and things like that.
There's the same thing here in Chicago. Okay. So we assume that people have access to all sorts of information. They use these data in the Chicago Tribune, the robust news. That's why I feel like homicide is most salient, in large part because homicides always get reported. And it's the same sort of thing. Also, if you look at the search, Zillow or Trulia especially, they actually map the crime data as well.
Okay, yeah, so in terms of mechanisms, that probably plays an important role in some of the temporal dimensions of the effects that you're looking
Almost
at.
surely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Almost surely.
Other questions?
Oh, yeah, for no other questions. So on your slide, I was going to ask you about what you have on what the intuition you have in your slide is what was occurring to me right now about the heterogeneity across neighborhoods in terms of expectation formation. So I would think in really high violent crime areas already, one more murder isn't going to make that much of a difference. People already have very low expectations. Whereas at the other extreme, with very, very low crime, maybe a very affluent neighborhood, people are so shocked, and there's always this phrase, well, this never happens around here. And I'm wondering whether expectations would change much there, so there conceivably could be low impact, just viewed as a really rare random event, where it'd be the intermediate sort of neighborhoods where there's presumably the biggest impact. I mean, is that?
No, so you hit exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what's going on in our state transitions, right? And so when I'm talking about heterogeneity, I'm talking about heterogeneity in actual, the preference parameters here. But in the state model, the LMM model, that's going to be captured, right? So that's part of the transition matrix, right? So people who live in let's say the most fancy neighborhood in Chicago is Lincoln Park. People in Lincoln Park aren't responding very strongly because they know with high likelihood Lincoln Park's not transitioning from that high state, right? So it's gonna dampen their sorting behavior, right? It's not gonna enter strongly in that because that if you remember that state transition matrix was 0.996 or something like that, right? But it's more like people who live in my neighborhood, or well, not so much my neighborhood anymore, but the neighborhood next to mine, right, where you're more on the margin, right? So additional crime could tip you one way or the other, or might be a signal that you're going one way or the other, and so therefore it might matter more in those intermediate. That's exactly the reasoning that we're trying to capture with the LMM model. Okay, what this heterogeneity that we're trying to build in is even more on top of that, is that there might be preference heterogeneity in terms of types of crimes, right? And so in what I mean here is that homicide you might not look at a homicide. You might look at a homicide and might take that as information that the neighborhood is changing or not, in terms of its state. But you might also, some people might not care as much, in large part because the search behavior, they've already kind of built in that homicides might occur, right? And so their parameters, their estimates, their capitalization effects or whatever in the reduced form model may be smaller than somebody in another type of neighborhood, right? And so there might be heterogeneity across neighborhoods and what that estimate might be, in large part because they have different preferences over crimes that they'd be willing to take near their home.
I wanted to jump in with one quick question before we have to end, David. Marcus, I wanted to ask, I know that we would expect there to be issues about bias in reporting of crime. So high crime neighborhoods often don't report a lot of the crimes that happen. So I was wondering if you could comment on how that might bias your results in this model.
Well, it would push us towards zero, right? Because, there's not nearly as much. So what it does is in relatively high crime neighborhoods, there's not nearly as much variation as we would have expected. Whereas in low crime neighborhoods, or typically low crime neighborhoods, ends up giving them a lot more variation, right? And so what those two effects would combine to do is make our coefficients smaller. So if anything, this could be seen as a lower bound, right? And that's why I focus so much on interpreting the homicide result, because homicides are very salient. They're very reported. You can't hide a dead body, or well, you can, but most likely you're not hiding dead bodies, especially when it's street crime. And so as a consequence, I think that's why it comes through so much more strongly in the capitalization, the reduced form model effectively. And we think that's what's driving most of the violent crime results.
Awesome. Thank you. It's 4:15. Thank you to all of our speakers. Feel free to stick around for a couple minutes if you have any other questions to ask Professor Casey. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Professor Casey, for presenting. And hopefully we'll see you all at our next seminar in a few weeks.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks for everybody for coming.
Thanks, Marcus. That was super, super interesting.
All right. Thanks. I'm glad you found it interesting.
Yeah. We'll see if